Ah, yes, the magic words. Okay, I'm Bruce McGee.
And I'm Steve Payne.
And we're here today with Denise Bates and Linda Langley. Hi, Denise and Linda.
Hello. Hi.
And I was really excited to see your book on Coushatta baskets. It's about the Coushatta Tribe's handmade baskets that they've made traditionally, I suppose. What's the name of the book and where can they buy it? Our audience.
The name of the book is Louisiana Coushatta Basket Makers, Traditional Knowledge, Resourcefulness, and Artistry as a Means of Survival.
Can you hold it up just a little more? Yes, there we go.
They can buy it at LSU Press online and also on Amazon.
Cool. And do you have like an audio version or like a Kindle version, or is it like paper only? Like what are the formats they can buy this in?
I believe there is a Kindle version of it available that you can get on Amazon, but I'd have to double check. But in terms of an audio, not yet, perhaps in the future.
Well, I mean, a book like this, you probably really want to see the pictures.
There are a lot of pictures, yes, and I'll just hold up my camera for a second that you can see. Part of the wonder is the baskets themselves. We talk about specific baskets in the book, and some of them are behind me, and their meaning, and we have a lot of photos as well, of course, of the photos of the basket makers themselves.
Cool. And I was just going to say, by way of getting into this, one reason this excited me, I've got a little Native American, and in my mom's living room for about, den, for about 30 years, there was a basket that held her magazines, just, you know, about the right size to put your magazines in. And I never thought a thing about it. And about a year ago, she handed it to me one day and said, "Would you go send this to your cousin Mark? It was made by his mother." So my Aunt Oline made baskets and, you know, parceled them out among the family, and she wanted Mark to have one of his mom's baskets. I had no idea somebody in our family knew how to hand make baskets. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the background of the Coushatta baskets, because these are unique in that what amazed me was that they make it out of pine straw sometimes.
Yes, they do. On the table behind me are both cane, river cane baskets and pine straw. The book is divided into 4 chapters that sort of take you through the history and the story of Coushatta, the people, and their basketry over many, many, many generations and hundreds, if not thousands of years. So Denise, do you want to talk a little bit about how the book is organized and the connection?
Certainly. Of course, I got to open my copy to remind myself of how we organized it. And so yes, as Linda pointed out, and I want to also mention that part of the materials we used to construct the book, you know, it was a variety of sources. So the oral histories were paramount, were first and foremost in the sources that we used, but we also drew on historical and archaeological evidence as a way of constructing this story, which is significant to understand how we were able to go so far back in time. And so yes, as she pointed out, it's divided into 4 different segments, if you will, chronological, but also to sort of follow the mobility of the Coushatta people from the Tennessee River Valley and through their many moves as they moved westward. And use the resources that were available to them. And early on, and what we have some evidence really early on is of the cane basketry, which is seen as, you know, the traditional materials that were used for their baskets. And Linda probably has a cane basket there she can hold up.
You'll have to speak up, Linda, so it'll switch to view.
This is an example of a cane basket. We talk about the person who made it, and both in the chapter 1, of course, in the introduction, and then again in chapter 4, talking about the revitalization of some of these traditions and interviews, as Denise said, oral histories and interviews that tribal members conducted with other tribal members, sometimes in their Coushatta language. And so we talk about not just the traditions, but the living aspect of who made these baskets and why, and when and where were they sold, and sometimes they return home. But this is an example of a cane basket that was made within the last 10 years in the tribal community.
It is so beautiful. And how do they do the dye of the what do you call the strips that you use to weave with? What's the proper term?
These are river cane. These are cane.
But I mean, what do they call the strips themselves when they're weaving? Like, pick up this and hand it to me. Like, you know, you've got a strip of cane. Do you just, is it called a cane strip, or is there some, like there's warp and woof when you do regular,
No, they're all referred to as river cane.
Okay.
But
so how do they dye it then? Do they still make the dye by hand, or like, what's that process like?
These are actually commercial dyes. And in the book we talk about, we have some of the earliest interviews with people who remember gathering the plants and the names for the plants. And over many years, the Coushatta people have also engaged in a language project and a historic archaeology project. So we do have information about the older ways of doing that. But in all honesty, the interviews and the discussions among the weavers today involve you know, things like Rit dye. In one case, somebody tried Kool-Aid. Another that holds the color. So there's always a question of how best to hold the color. And I'm told that the blacks and the purples for the LSU baskets are particularly difficult to get a true purple.
Oh yes, purple, for good reason, was the sign of wealth. In ancient Roman Empire, you had to dive into, well, it was Tyre, the city of Tyre, the harbor, and you got these shellfish, and you would boil them and make the dye out of that. And that's why purple was the color of royalty, because it's so darn hard to get a good purple.
Hard to do. These baskets were made by Leonard Batiste, and he could talk for many hours about the difficulties of getting a true purple.
Did they ever use indigo to derive a purple dye? Do you know?
Yes, they did. I don't know. I don't have any baskets that where the purple or the blue has really survived well from the historic period, but we do have that in the records that they would collect and use that. That was actually a major commodity in Indian trade at one time.
My mother's mother, the mother of Anna Lane, she homemade everything, you know, brooms. She made brooms from broom straw and gave to all the family, but she homemade dye when my mom was little, like, you know, the iron clay hills, she would make her red dye out of that iron, or maybe pink, I'm not sure, but and
it's a form of rust. It's ferrous oxide.
Yeah.
But it's all over North Louisiana and South Arkansas, Northeast Texas, South Oklahoma. It's the soil around here, as well as the native rock, has that rust in it.
Right.
Yeah. Aren't you doing this recording from Ruston, or is that just
well, the guy's name was Robert Russ. But yeah.
So yeah, that's
so those are the earliest baskets. And then, as Denise was saying, then we segue as you follow the Coushatta along the movement. And we do bring in the historical documents, the photographs, everything, including, you know, the economy, what they were, what kind of jobs they were having, because that would often dictate where people could collect the natural resources to make.
And what's the story on how they wound up moving? Was it Alabama they were originally to Louisiana? Like, was that part of the Trail of Tears, or was it other factors involved with the moving?
There were Coushattas Go ahead, Denise.
Yeah, I was just going to say their movement predates that period. I mean, so
Okay.
that's part of the really unique aspect of Coushatta history is their decisions to move westward prior. They were sort of predicting or seeing what was happening. And so they made this choice to move from the Tennessee River Valley, and then originally joined and became part of the Creek Confederacy in Alabama,
Right,
present-day
right.
Alabama. And in waves of groups began to move westward into, you know, the present day Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana, which is where you see Coushatta families settled.
And what
Did y'all
part
ever
of
run across the
Louisiana-
name of Park Custis in the course of your research? He is one of the co-leaders of the expedition that was trying to find. It was sent out by Tom Jefferson, and they were sent out to find the headwaters of the Red River. And they talk about in their journal running up on a Coushatta, we would say Coushatta, but they find that Coushatta village. I guess it's over south of what's now present day Shreveport someplace. But I mean, they mention it and devote a few pages to their encounter. Did y'all run across that name when you were doing your research, or?
Yes, we got the records of the Freeman and Custis expedition.
Uh-huh,
That's and a shout out to UL and the Public Archaeology Lab if they're watching. But we are working closely with them to try, and also TxDOT and other state agencies to track all of those mentions, line them up in our database with either state, recorded archaeological sites, or in our case, we've started our own historic archaeology project to go back and ground truth and locate the precise location of each of those encounters with Coushatta villages as they're described.
And
So
when you say located today, like what cities are they near?
Those sites, well, the tribe itself is located, the Coushatta Tribe of Louisiana is headquartered 3 miles north of Elton, in Elton,
Okay.
Louisiana. People often think of the casino on Highway 165 in Kinder, but the tribal headquarters and the community is located just north of Elton, Louisiana. The major river drainages is probably the best way to identify the movements, and that's the Tennessee River, the Alabama, the Tombigbee, Mobile Bay, across to New Orleans where they traded, up the Red River, down the Sabine and Calcasieu. And so a lot of movements, as Denise said, across 7 major states in the last 500 years.
One thing Stephen and I have learned over the course of this, so Stephen probably knew it before, but these tribes would trade over a pretty wide area, and you've got these beautiful baskets they make from whatever materials are at hand, and then you trade it for stuff you need that you don't have. So did you find that these baskets wind up in all kinds of places? I guess, it's hard to preserve a basket compared to something clay, but
yeah. I'm going to toss that question over. In terms of baskets being preserved in the right situations, like caves, dry caves have been preserved for thousands of years.
Oh, wow.
So we do have evidence of that. Within the last couple of months, there was an article about a 10,000-year-old basket being preserved. But Denise when Denise and I first met each other, she had done a tremendous amount of research from the historic period, and actually has published the book that started us talking about doing this one, which was on the trade. And it's called Basket Diplomacy, which is the intentional trade of baskets or gifting of baskets. So I'll turn it over to her to talk a little bit about that.
Please.
Yeah, and that might be a little bit later than what you're asking, Bruce. I'm not sure if your question was geared more towards the colonial period.
It doesn't matter.
Okay, well, then I'll talk a little bit about Basket Diplomacy, which is a book that came out in 2020. So it hasn't even been out very long. So it was last year, and it covers the late 19th century to the 1980s, mid 1980s. And so, so Basket Diplomacy, it's itself really, as you probably can imagine from the title, is about this tradition, this long tradition of Coushatta people gifting their baskets for a variety of reasons. This book primarily focuses on the political reasons of developing alliances and friendships among non-Coushatta people. And so that's, essentially what it traces, focusing on the 20th century as they made their way and created alliances with local neighbors in their present location in Southwest Louisiana.
So yeah, they were kind of newcomers compared to like the Caddo and some of the other
Chitimacha,
tribes. Yeah.
because they've been here, over 2,000 years, I think. The Chitimacha, a long, long time.
One of the influential chiefs, who's called Red Shoes, in the Alabama archives, they describe his statement of having had a dream or a vision. He saw the Creek Wars that were coming about 20 years before they started, and he encouraged about half of the Coushatta people to move over to Louisiana. The story picks up in the Spanish colonial records, where they are just amazed at his, they describe it as his diplomatic style. And one of the things he says to them, and of course, at this point, by the late 1700s, tribes are coming from different areas, and it's becoming, a question of who can settle where and how is all this going to work. And the colonial groups are running out of money to, house them. And so Red Shoe says, with your permission, first of all, let me help you deal with all these different and colonial groups. And as for me and the Coushatta people, with your permission, let me go request diplomatically of the Caddo chiefs, because the best place for us is on land that is reckoned as Caddo land. And so the way to proceed is for you to give me the okay to go and speak with them. And he does, and they do actually settle on what is Caddo land. And they should make a movie just about that.
Yeah, that's kind of amazing. What was the guy's name again?
They either call him Salus Mustabi, but in English, they refer to him as Red Shoes.
Red Shoes. Cool.
And he's living, late 18th, early 19th century?
He leads the group into Louisiana in 1797. So, and George Washington actually talks about him after the Treaty of New York in 1790. He says, he sends back an agent, and he tells in his notes, he's like, we can deal with any of these chiefs, but the one we have to watch the most, because he's so clever, is that old Chief Red Shoes. And we have to stay on their good side, or we won't have a southern border, basically.
Right.
Very, very interesting. I'm sort of summarizing and changing the language, but it's a wonderful story of what Denise's book, Basket Diplomacy, and then the Coushatta, our present book, it's the description of agency. They understood how things worked.
Yeah, and I guess he came in, and part of the way he got a little bit of land from the Caddo was, we can make these beautiful baskets, and here are some, which I'm sure they made baskets, but not like that. Like, this is our skill set.
And so often we talk about in the book also in the way commodities are valued in the European and colonial records. The mentions are of, gunpowder or corn, and the first encounters with Europeans are over corn. But what did you use to hold these things as you began? Your mother had a basket that she held magazines in.
Yeah.
You didn't think of the basket growing up. You thought
I never thought of that basket. It never
no, but
it's got to say, where did this thing come from? And it was my aunt,
but it's got a utilitarian value, like you said. It's got a utilitarian value, but also an aesthetic value, and a diplomatic political value. So that's three different ways to look at the objects.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And when you think about it, the two ways to carry grain would be baskets and pottery, maybe sacks, but pottery is so heavy.
Burlap or hemp, you could sew something out of some of that fabric.
And some of the early photographs that we have in the book do show some Coushatta families or children, the one with the children, that show big baskets where they were using that to collect, to gather cotton. And so, so this agricultural use or utilitarian use of it And that's another point also in terms of trade and gifting, however you want to look at it, is the adaptation of their choices that basket makers made on the types of baskets they made over time. And that was a very interesting point. And looking at what, some of their non-native neighbors, for example, they would like bread baskets or, certain kinds of baskets. And so more of the basket makers were leaning towards developing baskets or creating baskets that would have higher value for bartering or for selling.
They would fill a specific demand. They would find out
Right.
what kind of baskets
Exactly.
do these folks need.
Exactly. And so like you, I think there are a lot of families probably all throughout Louisiana that have baskets that they just never thought about where they came from. And
Right.
if you trace them back, I'm sure there'll be some very interesting stories that emerge.
Yeah, this is so fascinating.
One of the things we also talk about is in chapter 4 and the afterword is the deliberate choices the tribe makes to encourage the revitalization and the continuation of the basketry traditions.
Talk about that a little bit, because one thing Stephen and I have been concerned about is how our traditional ways are dying, that French has died out almost, and there are some movements to try to bring it back. So how did they preserve and then encourage the continuation of the basket weaving tradition?
And, until very recently, I think they didn't have to encourage it because it was such a part of the economy and the weavers. But the tribe has put a lot of effort and resources into teaching classes. And in the book, we include interviews with some of the youngest weavers who are under 20, for instance. And we talk about, they're very open about their motivations for keeping these traditions going. And it has to do with identity, what it means to them to be considered tribal, a member of the Coushatta Tribe, and almost a sense of obligation. The afterword to the book is written by 2 young women who are both 4th and 5th generation weavers. And they talk about what it means to them to teach their children that basketry is also got the responsibility for a way of looking at the world, a cultural value, a way of, giving back and seeing your connection to those people around you, your responsibility almost.
Yeah, like when I was growing up, once again, back to my grandmother's house, we'd go there in the summer. My parents would dump us off so they could have their 2-week vacation. Here we are in South Mississippi, on a working farm. And it's like, here's a pile of corn, start shucking. And so, there was this kind of apprentice. It wasn't that we went to a formal class to learn how to shell butter beans. Mother Spell would show us how, and then we would do it for several hours and get fairly good at it. So I guess traditionally this was passed on within families from generation to generation.
Yes, and we talk about that in the book as well. And people often ask me, even, in the interviews we've done, we'll get back pictures. Can you say definitively that this was made by this weaver? Because of course, back in the day, they didn't sign it. Sometimes we can. Sometimes people recognize a style or a technique of flowers or decorations, or sometimes, it's distinctive enough. But other times I'll say that style of frog, for instance, has only been made in this family. And I can show you going back 100 years.
Wow.
That is a mother who taught a daughter, who taught a daughter, who taught a daughter. And it's very powerful for them.
Is it mostly women who do this work?
So yes, although both men and women do it, but over in more recent time, the historic times, it became more associated with women due to the economic situation where many women had a harder time finding work in agriculture and in the timber industry, as many Coushatta men took work in those areas. So that was how many women began to contribute to their household economies.
Right. So they would be doing, the men would be out with kind of the regular job, and then this is some extra money to bring into the family.
Yeah, but with that said, though, I will say that men, you know, historically even have contributed in a lot of ways, whether as basket makers themselves or in helping in the collection of the materials. So for example, men going out in the timber industry and locating places where they can find cane, river cane, and going back and collecting and bringing it home. And so, you know, even though you can see the gender divide, it's not as cut and dry as that.
Right.
It's a whole community endeavor. Mm-hmm.
So the material, river cane, are you talking about like the cane we used to make fishing poles out of, and they strip that and then make that into the baskets?
Pretty much it is. When you go out into the woods with the weavers, they'll describe criterion of which cane makes a good basket. And the stands today, the modern stands, we call them elbows, the length between the joints are too short. So apparently a little bit faster growing variety is replacing the older one. And that's something that many of the southeastern tribes are working with the Forest Service and the Park Service to try to. And the same thing with the longleaf pine needle, that many of the timber where they clear cut, the timber company wants to plant a faster growing loblolly or something like that. And it's the needles are too short. You can't make them.
Right, because longleaf pine, you've got longer. We
usually tell people to look for something from the fingertips all the way to the elbows.
That's a long pine needle.
That's a long pine needle.
I have to wonder if they were working my granddad was a logger, my mom's dad, and I have to wonder about those old loggers, and particularly the ones that were from the Coushatta communities, if they were scouting those stands of timber while they were out cutting this stuff, if they were thinking, hey, this would make a good, the needles would make good material for the baskets. So they're doing two things at once. They're out there, looking around for trees to cut, or some timber buyer, because my granddad did that too for a while. He would go out and, look at so many acres of stuff, and he could tell you in his head, he was really good with math, but he could tell you, well, hey, this would fetch X price on the market, and you've got so many board feet that we can probably, extract from this particular acre of property. So I'm thinking they're doing something like that, but they're also cutting the stuff, but then they're maybe scouting it again to see if they can get those materials for the people that make the baskets. Is that fair to say, or do you think they were doing some of that? Or
absolutely, they were doing that. We actually have interviews where they talk about that. They're hired by a timber company, and then they'll go out and come back to the community and say, okay, we saw this. And and they go out, a group will go together and camp out and bring as much back as they can.
Cool. So did they use any other materials than cane and long pine needles? I'm thinking like corn husks seem like they'd be, they're not very rigid, but they're as rigid as a pine straw. Did they ever use anything like that to make other kinds of baskets, or were those the two primary?
Not mainly the Coushatta didn't. We do have one wonderful video interview with an older woman who made the corn husk dolls. They made blankets and saddle blankets and mattresses and things out of the Spanish moss.
Yes.
Palmetto, they'd thatch a roof, but primarily the way that, and let me illustrate by showing a Coushatta basket. And we talk about how tight, the weave is and how tight the coiling is. And so this one, you almost, can't squeeze, it's that tight. And these are the hallmarks of Coushatta basketry. You can see the lid here. It has to fit very tightly. You can't do that with any of those materials. Palmetto, it's too soft, it's just not gonna work. And then this was an earlier, we have photographs in the book showing the transition as we reckon it to the 1930s primarily.
Is that pine straw?
These are all pine needle baskets.
My goodness.
Look at the elephant. Can you see it?
Wow.
What is amazing about the elephant is you have to start each ear as a basket. The head is a basket.
Oh my goodness.
And each of these, if you can kind of see, it's hard, I know, but they're tiny, tiny, incredibly tightly coiled, the pine needle and the stitching. And
Now,
so
pine needles are normally dark brown. Do they have a way of bleaching it so it gets that light color? Like,
They're green when they first come off a tree, though.
yeah, exactly. They're green, and then they have a special way of drying them. And that we talk about also, but they have to be turned, they have to be rotated, they have to be, otherwise they will get a dark brown and brittle, and
right.
then they'll break if you try and coil them very tightly.
So you have to work with them when they're fairly fresh.
Look at how tiny this lid is.
Wow.
And it goes in the butterfly. So
Did they ever use any products? We had my family, my dad's family had a bunch of acres up right below the Arkansas line, and he was a farmer and postmaster, and they had pine trees on the property, but they also had cedar. Did they ever use any kind of tree bark, like cedar bark or pine bark or anything like that?
we do find bark and leather and some things on some of the baskets, either as a bottom or a decoration, but primarily not. There was a few who used white oak, grass. Some of the coastal grasses are very tight and very wiry, and you can use that. But still, in all interviewing, I don't even, dozens and dozens and dozens. We actually have an appendix with the name of the different weavers over the generations. We've looked in every archive, every photograph, every basket, and every museum we could find.
Wow.
Primarily river cane and longleaf pine needle.
So how much would like that elephant cost at a, if you're going to buy it today, a new one? Like,
Well, of course, the cost of the baskets has gone up a lot. We have baskets with tags that still say 15 cents, way back when, 100 or anywhere 60, 70 years ago. But the baskets are, it's up to each individual weaver. Sometimes they're around $20 a finished inch, but other times, and they're the amount of work, like the elephant.
yeah.
Have two known weavers that have ever made an elephant. That's too complex. So you're going to pay more for something like that.
Yeah, I'm thinking the person hours would be incredible when they sit down at the table and start weaving the thing. It's going to be amazing in terms of the length of time it takes to make it.
One of the younger weavers told me once that he figured out he was making about 5 cents an hour.
That sounds,
Oh God.
Oh man. So what are the tools you use besides just your fingers and the needles? Like are there needles that they, like sewing needles that they use, or like how do they do this?
Well, I'll start. I mean, yes, so they do have, so each weaver has their tools. They have a tool or a sewing box, I guess is what it's called, right? And so that's something that we were able to talk about in the book. And what's inside those sewing boxes varies by weaver, but it is generally a series of tools and initial basket starts and I think Linda can probably speak more to what's in the sewing boxes. I know your mother-in-law, I think we described what was in her sewing box at one point in the book.
Yes, we did. And, one of the things I really enjoyed doing was because we had tribal members interviewing other tribal members, and often in their language. So there are, it's more in the end notes, I guess, but there was such a interest in what do you call this little area here where you start the basket. And they were curious. Nobody ever asked them that in over 100 years of linguists and anthropologists. So they really enjoyed talking about that. And we would hear them all say, my basket box, my box, my box. And they said, what's in your box? And no one had ever asked them that either. But interestingly, the word for needle, to answer your question, is actually the same word that was used long ago. So one of the weavers told us about it really means anything sharp that you can use to poke through.
Pierce. Yeah.
Yes, to pierce. And it used to be bone, or it,
Right.
you know, metal came in, everybody, and this of course is well documented, but metal's just so much easier to work with.
Sure. Yeah.
So metal sewing needles are what's used now. And another thing that came out are like the word to weave. And you asked about this in the cane baskets, it's a different verb. Cane baskets are woven, that, you know, and then these are, the word for a pine needle basket being constructed is sewn.
Wow.
Sewn, and that we were asking questions about that, and they were just so interested and puzzled, like, well, who doesn't know that? Well, that was never recorded anywhere in the literature.
Yeah. Well,
Nobody
you
asked.
think about it, it would have its own jargon, just like quilting would, you know, or any other kind of cottage industry or any kind of home type craft, you know, program or whatever. It would have its own terms for particular items or particular techniques, I would imagine.
Definitely. And we were interested because the weavers, you know, we didn't even have the answers to some of this before we started, but the weavers' toolkit or basket might be pliers, you know, a saw to cut, or a very sharp knife to cut the cane, how the cane is split. And, you know, it was fascinating. And then the pine needle basket makers, their toolkit might be a thimble, a needle, a pair of scissors, a cloth to rub off the.
Oh, yeah.
So, and when we'd say, well, what's in yours? And not at first not get that, they'd look at us like, how could you make a cane basket with a needle? Like, of course you can't. So we learned, and they enjoyed being able to tell us and explain their process to us.
Well, and let me add to that too with the finishing. What strikes me in thinking about, especially the pine needle baskets and the finishing and burning of the ends, and you know, there's just such precision in technique involved in either sewing or weaving a basket, depending on the type. And so, yes, exactly. So their toolkits are going to look different. Their techniques are going to look different. And I will say too, the one thing, and I know that people talk about this often when you're talking about a traditional craft, is that it's not stagnant. They're constantly innovating. And that is something that's very much valued in the Coushatta community, of innovating.
You got Rit dye at the store. You don't have to go out and collect indigo anymore. You know?
That's right. That's
Yeah,
right.
you leapfrog past a certain number of steps. And I'm thinking, can you imagine the fine motor skills it takes to do this? I mean, it's pretty incredible.
Especially when you consider we have some, even at the reservation at a store, the gas station on the reservation has 2 long cases of these baskets. And some of them are literally as small as my little fingernail.
Wow.
They're a covered basket that's decorated with flowers.
Wow.
I can't even see anymore
Oh my gosh.
alone have the motor skills.
I've got trifocals, which means I try to see through my glasses.
I guess they could do some of that with a magnifying lens, maybe at least nowadays, and just stick that under a magnifying lens and
like
do
the
the weaving with
jewelers.
that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I thought that, but nobody does that. And one of the things that was so interesting in interviewing the younger weavers is, you know, I noticed this when we did the language teaching as well. I could think somebody sounded good, but they didn't sound right. And the mark of distinction was to say, yes, that person sounds like us. They look like us. I noticed the same thing with the baskets, that, you know, I would think something was nice and they would say, doesn't quite seem right to us. But to be acknowledged as, you know, not so much how they did it, but the overall finish, it felt right, it looked right, is a great mark of honor for the younger weavers.
Right, it's got the right style to it.
another thing that really intrigued Denise and I. Denise did a lot of the work, and a shout out also to our tribal council at the Coushatta Tribe of Louisiana, tribal chairman David Sickey, and the Renella Fontenot, who's the director of the Department of Cultural, Historical, and Natural Resources at the tribe, and our tribal archivist, Mariana Luquette. We scoured the archives. They made personal visits to the National Museum of American Indian, cataloged every basket in the vast empire of the Smithsonian.
Oh my gosh.
And
So they would just be going down shelves and say, this is a Coushatta basket. And then
some of it you could find from the catalogs, but others we searched for over the past century, who visited the tribe, where did their collections go, and so on. And Denise was very instrumental. She had gone personally to Princeton and some of the bigger archives to search out these records for us. And we began to see things that intrigued us that would open further research questions. And one of those was a basket like this, which we talk about in the introduction to the book and again in the end. And if you can see, this is definitively a Coushatta basket. It's got the tag. It's made by a tribal member, but this is not, this looks Southwest, right? I mean, what about this looks Coushatta, right? And we said, well, what engenders a basket like that? Another example was one with a Pueblo design, or my mother-in-law's was at the Smithsonian, and it's the famous man in the maze design. And we didn't know, we were baffled. So we had to go back and do interviews with, either the person, if they were still living, or the descendants of that person. Do you remember them making this basket and why? And it turns out sometimes somebody asked for a certain style. Sometimes, in this case, the woman saw a photograph and wondered if she could copy the photograph in a basket. And then in the case of my mother-in-law, I asked her, the people at the Smithsonian said, this is an incredible example of diffusion, and the Southwest cosmology of the man in the maze has reached the Southeastern. And I went back and I said, Mom, why did you make that? She said, that one? I saw a piece of pottery once, and that little man was standing in the middle. I thought, I wonder if I could do that in baskets. She said, I did it, but nobody really liked it, so I never did it again. I don't remember.
Oh my God.
That ended up in a textbook with a kind of erroneous conclusion. But so Denise and I, and again, with the help of the tribal members, their families, archivists all over the country, we were able to find some of these questions and actually find answers to them.
Well,
that reminds me of an old gag in Mad Magazine, or Cracked, one of the old satire magazines of some. What it is a, I shouldn't even give this away yet, but they find this, the piece is, the gag is set, I think, about 1,000 years from now, and they find this object, and they say that it's part of a religious rite or something like that, or a religious veneration or whatever, and turns out what the object is part of a roll of toilet tissue. But they, the archaeologists of 1,000 years hence, completely misidentify what the article was, and it's the spindle that the toilet tissue sits on so that you can remove it from the roll. So there's a lot of pseudo-intellectualism going on here, folks.
Well, I think it also really is a nice lesson in misunderstanding, and
yeah, absolutely.
And that's something too that the Coushatta people have, historically. I mean, the things that Linda and I found, and I'm just thinking of in archives, a lot of misplacement of photographs and documents that relate to the Coushatta community that are placed in. I found some photographs, for example, at Princeton, of Coushatta families put in files that were for Native Alaskan villages. And the only reason why I found them is because I had more time, and I just thought I would, entertain myself and look through their photographic collection. And lo and behold, I recognized faces, and we were able to get them recategorized. But I mean, these are things that I think the Coushatta historical record, is really marred with all of this misplacement and misunderstanding. And
how long have y'all been doing this research? It seems like a vast amount of
Well, I'm laughing because one of the tribal members who co-wrote the afterwards, she said to me, "That book is very nice. You finally finished. Seemed like you've been doing this a long time." And I thought about it. My kids said their entire lifetime, and my daughter's 26. So
right.
I don't know, Denise, what would you say?
Well, you've been mulling over this book for much longer than I have, certainly, living in the community and everything. I think, basket diplomacy really started in about 2012, and that was the sort of precursor for me in getting involved in this current book project. So, it's been a while, certainly, but it's been such a joy.
Our colleague, and she's just stepping down as department chair and going back to folk life stuff, but Susan Roach has done a lot of this with quilts all over the state.
Yeah, I know her.
And quilts. She shows up everywhere, right?
Wonderful. Yeah.
So I'm sure she's got some more books in her, but this is stuff she's been doing since she was maybe not a kid, but she was
probably since she was a grad student, I would imagine.
She was hauling around those heavy recording, tape recorders back in the day.
We get that from people. So how long are you and Stephen going to do this, Bruce? Or how long is this project going to end, Stephen? And we get this from family members. We get it from colleagues, because we started 10 years ago this June was it 10 years ago, Bruce, on the big project, and 9 on the podcast?
No, it's 9 years. We started in 2012.
So 9 and 8 then. Yeah, 9 for the website and 8 for the podcast.
Right.
When are y'all going to finish doing this? Well, no, we don't intend to finish.
Look at this book, and what a new, for us, area it's opened up. And this is stuff I would have never thought about, but then I hear about it and it's totally fascinating. Now, one of our interviewees talked about trying to make baskets so you could carry water in them. Is there anything like that with these? Any process to make, a basket that you can carry water in?
Yeah, I asked you about waterproofing. I'm the one that asked you that during the LSU session the other day.
Yes, and we talked about that. The community was really interested in that. That question was a great question. And that's actually come up in the discussion. So as Denise said, nothing's static and it keeps on going. So now we'll probably see people trying to figure out how to waterproof a basket.
As I recall, it's been a while since we did the interview, and I don't even remember who said it, but it seemed to involve soaking the basket so that it swole. You had to keep it wet in order to carry water in it. And then when it dried out, it would become porous again.
We don't have any examples of true waterproof baskets. And that's a really great question, because that gets back to the beginning of the interview where you asked about, would ceramics be better? And we're looking into all that. Some of maybe the animal hides. We don't have an answer, but the baskets themselves, from what we've seen, we don't have any examples of them being lined or caulked, as it were.
Right. You'd have to put something in there to, I could say lining it with clay or something, and I don't know, or pit. Yeah.
Bottle and knob, maybe something.
Yeah, you'd have to find something that wouldn't be poisonous to drink.
Yeah, because by definition, the basket is an organic material, which means it's going to decay over a period of time.
Yeah.
Well, what was the largest basket you've seen? I wanted to ask y'all that the other day, and I think I came in on the latter part of the interview or the talk, and so I didn't get to ask you earlier. But have you seen any baskets that, lack of a better word, were life-size baskets, like as big as a person? Anything quite that large? Or
we do have a few that are almost that large. I don't see a lot of them. And now it's popular for people to request their newborn baby shots in one of these gigantic baskets. And so we're sort of trying to figure out, do we protect them more. They really should be kept. Some of those baskets are 100 years old. But for the most part, you wouldn't have as much use for a basket that's life-sized. Though, you know, for carrying children or other things, usually it's a little bit smaller than that. The largest are clothes hampers or storage containers. And again, those, to make it that large, once you fill it, it's not really mobile anymore.
Yeah. It's defeating its purpose, because I guess portability is probably one of the qualities you'd try to seek when you're making one.
Yes.
Or for the aesthetic purposes. I mean, one of the larger ones I've seen was at the casino, was in the display case there.
Yeah, I've been sitting here thinking the whole time, it's got to be a statement of creativity of those artisans when they're making this, that, hey, I made this, but it's an expression of my, imagination or my creative spirit, just like a quilt would be. I don't know, does that make any sense? Or
It definitely does. And as materials, I was talking earlier about the cane or the longleaf pine needles getting more difficult to find the right type and the right consistency. You would have to really almost have a buyer, which, you hate to say, but a reason to spend all of your time and all of your resources on a basket that large at
right.
the time.
Yeah, a commission piece in effect. Like I
Right.
know a woman on Twitter who's an artist, and I mean, she does commissioned art all the time. And she does it. I mean, some of it's pretty inexpensive, but some of it can be, $800 and more. And then she sells prints that are really reasonable at, $20 and $30 and $40. But it would be, I guess, it's like a commission piece where you hire the artisan to make it for you.
Yes.
Well, in addition to the individual artistic purpose of them, I also wanted to bring up the community aspect of it, and the making of them in groups, and it being really an event where people come together and sew or weave baskets as a community at people's homes, or in more organized basket weaving events that are organized by the tribe. And so, that's another big aspect of this. It's not just the individual artistic value. It's that opportunity to come together with different generations.
Is it like the old, they would get women in a community to make a quilt?
Quilting bee.
Yeah, quilting bee.
My great grandmother and grandmother did those things, and my great aunts did them all the time. Is it kind of like that? Like a quilting bee?
Somewhat, but also very impromptu. We have so many interviews where people talk about the social aspect of getting together, enjoying the companionship, each one working on their own basket, but being able to share news, look over and say, wow, that's different. What, or I'm running out, can I borrow? Or, something else. And now with our younger weavers, even their interviews all reference this social aspect, like Denise was talking about, being able to visit, being able to watch an older weaver and make sure your patterns and your stitching are right, getting a nod of approval, hearing a funny story, staying up way too late without realizing it. But again, each one working on their own artwork.
And I was just going to say, if you're there along, several hours, say 5-6 hours, you're going to get hungry. So then you're going to eat together too. So you have a common meal, and the table. Bruce and I come out of biblical studies and then jumped into literature. And we know that the table is one of the most powerful symbols in the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Bible, both, because people come together at the table, not just to feed their bodies, but to, build community. And so they're at table. I mean, this is the image that comes up so much in scripture. And in the ancient Near East, all over the ancient Near East, this idea of people at table and sharing that meal, but sharing their culture, sharing their very beings with other people.
I was also going to say that it speaks to the resilience of their language. This coming together and having opportunities to speak Coushatta and to learn and to observe, and that's how a lot of the learning happens, is through observation. And also there we have great interviews also of weavers talking about how that helps, weaving together helps them to not be lazy, to keep up with, you know, their efforts, but also to push them to innovate and to improve. And so, you know, there's a lot of function, not just, you know, outside of the social, but there's also the cultural transmission and opportunities to grow in this craft.
Like musicians having a jam session, you know, a pickup band is playing and they're in somebody's basement or somebody's garage or whatever, and they're playing, or even in somebody's living room, and they're all trying to outdo each other in a way, and yet contribute to the overall product, which is a finished piece of music.
That's a great analogy. Yes, I think so too.
What in terms, I want to go back to the dyes because Bruce was talking about that earlier. So they, I guess, are any of them using traditional dyes anymore? Are they all using commercially prepared stuff like RIT dye or something else? I mean, have you kind of run across very much about that, or?
No, we haven't seen people using traditional plant-based dyes recently. We did interview one woman who did talk about that, but sadly she's passed away. And the you know, the overall consensus, in fact, they've asked us if we could have workshops where they could experiment or get other tribes to come back, you know, to show them. But it takes so much experimentation of how long do you leave it in there for? You know, is yellow onion, or do you have to use purple onion? You know, would you have to soak it twice? How would, you know, it's too long ago. It's now.
And you have to fix it too. You have to fix the dye so it's not going to run all over the place.
There's a lot of discussion about it. Every Easter when people dye Easter eggs, this starts coming up again, and people want to see, could we do it? Should we do it? We have one example in the tribal archive collection of somebody who dyed the pine needles instead of the raffia. And we've seen a few baskets like that, but they said it's so time consuming. And even with the modern dyes, is that some, you know, it's an ongoing dialogue and negotiation. And I think the weavers would be interested in that, but without something, again, a commission or some other compelling reason, most of them right now stick with the commercial dyes.
We had gone 3 or 4 years ago down to Germantown, over here west of Ruston, to do an interview at this old German settlement. It's what became the nucleus of the Menden settlement back in the 1830s. So it's an old settlement. And they've got the little village of about 6 or 8 buildings still preserved. And as Bruce and I were driving in there, we started seeing as you get further west of Ruston, and our dirt around here is pretty orange red, but as you get closer to the Red River, that dirt gets very red, again, because of the ferrous oxide, all the basically rust that's in the soil. And Bruce started telling me the story that he told the two of you about his grandma, and taking that dye and extract, or taking that red color, that red pigment, and extracting that and using it to dye clothes. And I said, well, again, you'd have to fix it some way. And I know old timers around here used to use salt or brine or something, but they would use some sort of preparation like that, and it would basically freeze the dye in place so it would not be running. And so what they're doing basically is home chemistry. You know, you think about it, and I have to say that because my area in literature is the Enlightenment, but they're doing home chemistry. They're using what they have been using for centuries, and it's become almost kind of an instinctive kind of a thing of what they do, but they're going through a basic kind of a left-handed scientific process in a way, to try to, you know, find something that will work and will be durable and yet be beautiful at the same time.
I don't think there's any other way to do it than other than that. You know, when you think about the value of salt historically, across the world, certainly among the natives in Louisiana, the native tribes, you know, that you'd have to really have a compelling reason. That's very valuable for preserving your food. Do you want to use that, you know, to fix your color? So you see very early on people trading for, and there's a whole literature and native literature, but trading for cloth or things that it's just a whole lot easier than trying to experiment and make it yourself.
Sure. Yeah, again, you're leapfrogging past that initial step. You know,
Yeah.
and if you think about that, the wider your web of trade becomes, the more access to people and to goods that you have, but also artistically, the more access you have to different ways of creativity or exercise your creativity. I mean, y'all read about Poverty Point and those natives living over there. We know they were trading with native peoples all the way up into the Ohio River Valley. In other words, up into Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, up into that area, Illinois, that area. And the reason we know it is that the artifacts are stuff that was made up there and then shipped down here via the Mississippi River. When Ohio would hit the Mississippi, come down here, the river's course was not what it is today. You know, the river's changed course a lot of times since they lived there. And I think they say that Poverty Point was at that time closer to the Mississippi than it is now. And so it was pretty easy, at least for them, to get on some sort of a barge or boat or something, bring that stuff down here, and then transport it inland to where Poverty Point now sits. Did these people, you said that they were using the baskets for basket diplomacy. In the old days, how far do we know that these baskets went besides, say, Louisiana and maybe Arkansas? Was it just this immediate area? Did it go into further into the southeast, like say in Alabama and places over that way, or was it mostly the south central U.S.?
You know, we explore that in the book, and we look at the colonial records. But interestingly enough, for instance, the papers of the War Department, or, you know, commerce or things, other commodities are listed, but the baskets, again, that were used to carry or contain them often are not. So then how do you find them? Well, archaeologically, you know, baskets or goods that belong to the person may have been interred with them. Well, then that's something that either doesn't survive or becomes, you know, a whole different category. So, you know, we really weren't able to get the documentation or the evidence to answer that question conclusively. But we have, from what we could see, their baskets seem to have been traded more locally and regionally. That may have been only in the last couple hundred years, but it makes sense if you think about probably every group that traded had their own baskets that they made. So for instance, when we interviewed somebody about the local trade patterns, she said that once the farmers had bought a basket or traded for a basket before the, you know, money was used or exchanged, they would bring that basket to the Indians, you know, empty, whereas they would go around, you know, in the wagon, and the farmer would fill it with rice. The Indians would take it, put it in their container, hand them back the empty bag. You know, the basket was not as valuable on both sides as what it contained. And that probably goes back a while and probably limits the, you know, the distance to some extent. But again, we don't have a conclusive answer.
Right. Well, yeah, because again, there's the durability question. How long is this thing going to last?
Right.
I will say though, at the local level, I mean, there in living memory, there's still a lot of, you know, stories among local tribes outside of the Coushatta who remember, you know, the early, well, not so early, but more recent trading. You know, the Mobilian language itself is a trade language that's a result of these interactions. And,
oh, right.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot of local evidence to that. And again, it's, even though it's harder to trace further back, I mean, common sense will tell you that this is not just locally focused. You know, that this is,
right.
there's a whole trajectory and history of this kind of trading. And, you know, unfortunately, the baskets just seem, in the documents, are invisible. But
right,
again,
like a grocery bag.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
I've
which
got
is also organic, unless if it's one of those, you know, cloth or whatever type bags or plastic bags, because the old ones were paper. And they'll disintegrate after a certain period of time.
Yes, I'm an old pro at grocery bag luggage, where you just stuff everything into a bag and go on your way. But they don't last that long. So I've got a kind of Alice Walker derived question. She had a story, everyday use, about two sisters fighting over what to do with Mama's beautiful
The quilt.
quilt that she made. And one of the sisters wants to hang it on the wall, and one of the sisters wants to put it to everyday use, i.e. Lay it on the bed to keep warm at night. So what's the kind of division with baskets? Sounds like some of these baskets were never made for everyday use. They were always made like with diplomacy. This is so beautiful. You're going to sit there and look at it. So how much of these baskets typically wind up on a shelf for people to look at it? How many wind up in my mom's den with a bunch of magazines in them?
It's tough to answer also. I would answer it again chronologically or temporally that, prior to probably 1950s, the 60s, maybe the Louisiana craft initiatives. And so some of those were a little bit earlier, but they were probably primarily used in an everyday way to carry eggs, to store magazines, sewing baskets. We try to record as much of that information as we can when a basket or a person who's traded them, when we talk to them about that. But in the last 50 years, I would say people have started to understand and see and value these as pieces of art. And in the book, we talk about that a lot of that is through the direct, deliberate efforts of the tribe to shift the public perception of a craft and elevate it to, again, that's not our distinction, but to elevate it to an art. And that seems to have been successful in the last 40 or 50 years.
Well, I'm sure you can make a lot more money for a nice basket, like the ones you were showing us, or like an elephant. Well, there's no everyday use for that. It's going on a shelf somewhere, right? Maybe you'll put some jewelry in it.
It's an art object. It's an art object.
Yeah, that's its intent.
Well, and I will say too, outside of the economic factors is the visibility. And that goes back to the basket diplomacy concept,
right?
Which was coined by Mr. Ernest Sickey, as I pointed out in the other interview, as a way to describe what he was doing. And it was a tradition that he picked up from generations prior to him. But this notion of using these baskets as a calling card for the tribe and taking them out to Washington, D.C. and New York and Baton Rouge or wherever he was meeting with people, and just leaving a little basket on the desk of a politician who he was trying to get to help to support and advocate on behalf of the tribe in those early days. And that he would recount these stories of going back and seeing those baskets on the shelves behind the desk, and they became conversation pieces that was sort of the point, is to create this visibility. But at the same time, then the tribe was also getting phone calls from the wives of these politicians asking where they can purchase more. So it did entice them in that way.
I totally forgot until this moment on my file cabinet. I've got a small basket that was made by the grandfather of one of my students who came from Alaska. And so it's an Alaskan basket just sitting in my office with, stuff in it, but like you say, a conversation piece, right?
Well, and you think in places like Louisiana where race is a big issue politically, where Indigenous people in Louisiana felt invisible. It's still do to a great extent. And so when you use a basket as a way of identifying a group, it really delineates them as an Indigenous community. And so that was that was something that was unique and not just stir conversation, on a superficial level, but help when there were very serious political issues at stake here. And in the Coushatta's case, in getting reinstated as a federal tribe. And so, there's, there's a lot of layers to this, but I think it's really important when we talk about the uses that it's beyond the economic. There's a lot at stake here.
It's like a literary symbol in a way, where it's operating on a lot of different levels. Um, I'm curious, do Freeman and Custis mention any baskets in their journals? Do you recall any references to that?
Nope. They do describe some of the customs and some of the people and some of the houses. And we have other explorers' accounts of the last, I mean, we even have some of the DeSoto Journal accounts. And they describe the corn, but not the baskets it was stored in, or, you know, so on. So they just, as Denise said, they just tend to be invisible.
A classic case of not seeing the forest for the trees, I guess. It's almost like these, because I'm thinking of them as not just as these storage vessels, but as art objects. And they're not seeing the beauty of these art objects in a way, and yet we know they appreciated beauty. You have to wonder why they didn't notice that. Particularly the more elaborate baskets, not just a simple basket, but one that's got, you know, a really elaborate sort of coloring or beautiful coloring, or a design that's particularly eye-catching or whatever.
I think that's a great topic for, you know, academics, for students. Why is that? I think that's a great question. And it's,
I would speculate a little bit gendered, because you know, if these guys are going around, what are Spanish explorers interested in? Food. They're hungry. That's why they're here, because they're hungry. And so they'll talk about the corn, but they don't really ask a lot of questions about baskets. You know, but you guys come along and start asking, okay, what's the thing you call where you keep your tools? Well, that's my box. Okay, well, you know, nobody ever thought to ask that before, because it was probably men asking the questions.
And they're looking for precious metals like silver and gold too.
right.
Particularly out in the Southwest, like in New Mexico, Arizona, et cetera. So.
Yeah, you got some gold in that basket?
Well, let's go back. I want to go back to the way that the people, the communities school this into the newbies or into apprentices. What was the youngest age of somebody that was making a basket? Have you seen any, like what we would say grade school age kids, elementary age kids, like say 7, 8, 9? I mean, I'm thinking about my nieces and nephew. He's 6, I think. My niece is 10. Did you see any children that were that young that were making baskets?
So in the interviews, a lot of the people, you know, describe starting at that age, and being maybe 9 or 10 when they sell their first basket, sometimes to a family member. But from the younger weavers today, the proficiency starts maybe, you know, what we consider now the age of adolescence, 12, 13, 14, in terms of the community saying that person is really good, that looks good, that looks right. Because it just takes so long. It takes so much concentration and, you know, desire. And we have a really wonderful interview after the book, did in cooperation with the Park Service for Festival International, that where one of the younger weavers talked about that moment, sort of when he decided, no, you know, just okay, loosely straight, it's not enough. I want it to be just right. And started bringing the basket around, calling the older weavers and asking them and showing them. And it just takes a level of maturity that I think you have to get into at least your early teens. Again, don't want to step on anybody's toes. I have grandkids and kids that weave. My daughter decided, I think I have that example here somewhere, maybe not, but she made her first basket sitting with the weavers when she actually found out she was expecting and was going to be a mother. She started going to the basket making sessions and said she just realized she had to. She'd started baskets, she'd made little ones, she never did the, you know, she did like kids do. And then she said, no, that's not enough. It has to be right for me to pass this on to the next generation. And I should say, in that sense, I'm married to, I usually start my interviews by saying in Indian that I am not Coushatta. My husband is Coushatta. My children and my grandchildren are Coushatta. But this was just one example, and it struck me that it took that level of maturity for her to get to, the point where she just, an okay basket wasn't enough anymore. So that's my answer to it. Of course, people have, that's changed as well in our society, but there are many answers, but I would say a little bit older than K-12, maybe junior high, at high school at least. What do you think, Denise?
Oh, I would agree in terms of the exposure starts really young. I mean, we have pictures. I was just looking in the book at Heather Williams, who runs the Little Indian School, and with preschool age children getting exposed to it early on, so that they can get their hands on it. But in these community, either whether impromptu or organized, weaving circles or gatherings, children are all around. They're exposed to it, especially if they have weavers in their families.
It has to be a source of pride for the adults of any age to look at their, niece, nephew, son, daughter, grandchild, whatever, and say, my child made this. And it's and probably the first effort or two is not all that great, but they get that proficiency in doing it. And some of them get to be real artists in terms of what they're making, I would imagine, particularly by the time they hit their 30s or whatever.
Even Leonard Batiste, who we talked about earlier, who made these beautiful cane baskets.
Yeah.
He talked about having to relearn. His father was a very proficient weaver, Solomon Batiste. And Leonard said, he learned as a kid, he did some, he didn't pay enough attention. And when he got into his 50s and 60s, and he said, wait a minute, we've got to keep this going. He tried to remember everything, and he ended up having to take apart one of his father's baskets to remember, until the muscle memory finally kicked in. It just, he was at a different stage of his life, and then approached it differently.
Well, that brings up a good point. I mean, he essentially reverse engineered something that had gone before. Do any of them do that to create a new object? Do they reverse engineer things and say, well, here's what grandmother so-and-so did, or grandfather so-and-so, and so I'm going to do it, but do it one better? I mean, do they do that kind of thing, or?
I think so. I would say all peoples to some extent have, especially when they realize, to us, we say, well, but would it be traditional or something? But what's traditional? It's, if you're a Coushatta and you made it, then the tradition keeps going on. So there's no reason not to do that, to ask questions and to examine things. So I would say
the tradition is definitely dynamic. It's not static, in other words.
Very much so.
Well, I'm curious about any kind of future books that y'all might plan that say would spring out of the research y'all did with this one. Is any kind of future book that would use this one as kind of the sort of the springboard for anything that will come, say 5 or 6, 7 years down the road? Or
Well, we haven't discussed that per se.
no.
We have started working on plans for a documentary and some other related projects, and have actually applied to the NEH and other potential funding sources. But
and this would make a great LPB.
That's what I'm thinking. Yeah.
That's what we think as well.
We're glad you agree.
No, it would. I mean, we've got this dream about turning some of our writer stories into documentaries, and I mean that takes some real work, but it takes an eye for figuring out which stories would, kind of be good for that sort of treatment, because you're moving into a different medium. You're working, from some created object, moving into the visual medium to shoot a documentary, and it has its own demands on it.
But at least you have like show and tell, like you can show the baskets, you can show people working on the baskets, you can interview people. So it has the stuff that documentaries would be looking for, I would think.
Well, not only that, it will be tribal driven. So, Linda and I are, we're
Right.
helping to facilitate the story, but it's not our story.
Sure.
And so that's one thing that, that's the reason why the oral histories were so important for this book and for basket diplomacy as well. But the documentary is a whole different platform that will enable that kind of effort to give the tribe a platform to tell their own story in their own way. And hearkening back to what we were referring to earlier about the story being wrong and being told wrong so many times, and sometimes in subtle ways, but other times in very big ways that really matter. And so this is kind of, this is how I see myself. I position myself as, it's a facilitator, it's as someone who is helping in the efforts, but it's been a wonderful experience.
Well, hopefully it would disseminate their story to a broader audience too. And that, to me, that's a big reason why we bring writers like y'all on the show every week, is to try to sort of broadcast their message or share their particular work with a wider audience each week, and to try to kind of give them a boost or kind of a multiplier effect so that more people know about their work. And hopefully something like a documentary would do that too.
I want to quote, by way of agreeing with what you all are saying. This is the last line of our, the acknowledgement section of the book. And we say, it takes the determination of an entire tribe to tell their story. Thank you all for choosing us to facilitate this telling. And I have been fortunate enough to be present and to have the elders in discussions decide that it's really time for the Coushatta people to begin to tell their story, because for many reasons, but as Denise said, that it's either absent from the curriculum, from the educational materials, from the schools, from the general public, or it's inaccurate. And so I think we feel very strongly, this is the tribes, the basketry, the history, the culture, the language. If they choose, as they've done, to keep telling their story, then we're honored to be chosen to facilitate that telling. And we appreciate, forums like what you've provided us here to further facilitate that telling. And we look forward to it continuing, but it's their story. So it's really not about us.
Well, you just brought up a good point. What do they do to say spread this message or share their creativity with, say, kids? Like in elementary school, middle school, high school. Do they do any initiatives like that, where they're like a cultural minister would bring a program and bring some of the artisans into the schools and try to educate the kids? Is there anything at all that exists like that?
There is. They do. But it's so it's localized, or it's one person goes out. A lot of times they'll come to us and say, can I borrow some older baskets? Or in one case that just amazed me, the teacher it was for a Louisiana history class, and they had given this older gentleman who's a tribal elder a list of questions. And he came in to me and he said, can you help me? The teacher asked these questions, and like, were we nomadic? I said, you don't have to, just tell your story the way you tell it. Those are words that we've, incorporated, but, we don't need a dissertation on movement versus migration versus seasonal gathering and so on. Tell them how you grew up, what you gathered for the baskets, what your mother and father, it can be an authentic voice. It can be what you want to say. And we find that we say that again and again every year, every new teacher, every new group of students. So now with the pandemic, I guess one of the silver linings, it's given us time at the Coushatta Tribe to step back and to say, okay, let's do this with the Division of Archaeology and the State Department of Education and LPB, and let's do this instead of scattershot. Let's really put out something that like the book that will send a consistent message, and people can refer to it over time instead of every year they have to gather up the baskets and go do a classroom talk.
Mhm. I'm thinking that would be so good. I mean, I would have appreciated as a kid growing up in Baton Rouge, having somebody come in and give like a guest, lead a guest discussion, like on this topic, for example. I mean, because we had things, but it was stuff like we did a thing on the Battle of Baton Rouge during the Revolutionary War and things like that. And they took us downtown to the old state capitol, and they had an exhibit down there with actual uniforms of some of the old Spanish regulars, so they actually had the things preserved, and I saw what their uniforms look like and that kind of thing. And we had, the curator came and led this discussion with us, but I'm thinking something like you're doing would also be equally as helpful to go around the state and share this with these school kids and these high school students as well, and let them know about the creativity of these people who they've not passed into history. I mean, it's still a living culture.
Yes, and Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities is another partner, and ways that we can reach the students, reach the teachers. And the pandemic taught us Zoom, like the platform we're on. So we're talking about a multi-phased approach to build the tribe.
So are there places online you can order these baskets for people who are out of range of coming to the actual, shops where they're sold in person?
A couple of our weavers have online, either a website or a Facebook site. And so I can send you some of that. Those are the younger weavers. And they can
Etsy
also,
would be a perfect place for this stuff, set you up an Etsy shop.
Right. And I can also send you some links for getting hold of us at the tribe. What we do is just facilitate. We're, in the cultural department, the gift shop at the reservation is also a place that people can
Right.
I can provide that for you. There's also a gift shop at the casino that I believe stocks baskets.
Oh, great. But go there when you get there, because you might be broke when you leave. Or you might need a basket to carry all your money out the door. Can't win it if you're not in it. So it seems like the book is generating a pretty good bit of excitement. You want to talk about the response, to the book so far?
Well, it just came out, so there's not, I'm sure Linda probably heard a lot more feedback than I have so far, but as I'll point out, I'm at Arizona State University, so I'm not local, but within my own sort of cohort of academics who work in Indigenous studies, this is something that really resonates with some of the work that's being done on California basket weavers and Oklahoma weavers and so forth. So it's fitting right into that literature, as well as the role of women in maintaining resilience within their communities. And so it's, so I could speak to that so far, but in terms of the more broader impact yet, that's still yet to be determined, I suppose.
One of the things that in the process, Denise and I discussed at length and discussed with the Language and Cultural Committee at the tribe. So the completed manuscript was given to all members of the Language and Culture Committee prior to, and we said just Post-it note. We actually gave it out with packs of Post-it notes. Tell us where you have questions, you disagree, we left something out, you don't want something included. And we got good response from that. And because of that continual involvement, it's really their voice that we were trying to get out. It's been very well received in the tribal community. Some of the most gratifying comments to me, a colleague who's an archaeologist, very well known in Southeastern archaeology, but out of this state in Alabama, he contacted me, and he, people like that who say this fills a gap, understanding from the material record, how were these made? What were the people thinking about? Why were these transitions made, and so on. That was very gratifying to me. And also an email I received from somebody who said, I feel very strongly I'd like to return a basket to the tribe. Now that I've seen the book, I believe I know who this basket was made from. It's been in my family for a while, and where my grandmother bought it, and it really belongs with you. So those kinds of things were very touching to me, and the reaction in the tribal community. Although, as we talk about in the book, that not being boastful is a cultural value. So I cherish the one comment where the woman said, "Oh, you finally, after all these years, you did it." I guess it's finally coming out. So that was also very, very nice to me. And they said that they liked it, and that meant everything.
Well, good. And it seems like it's already sparking further conversation from what you say, that your research will lead to more research, and like people recognizing stuff and being able to then add to the body of knowledge that you've already built up.
So yeah, and sparking other research, well, I would hope so. I hope that it does contribute to ongoing works. I know there are a few manuscripts in other parts of the country that are in the works. I've reviewed a few for a few presses, so I know what's coming down the pipeline, and this really contributes to that conversation, which really, that is very rewarding and satisfying in itself. I mean, but to me, primary, that the weavers themselves like it, as Linda pointed out, that to me is the primary audience in my mind. And it's, if they feel like that is representative of them, then it's all the more joyful for us that it can be read by others, and it will help to fill a gap in scholarships and historical understandings and so on and so forth. So that's what I'll say to that.
How much do they borrow from other basket weavers in terms of creating their own baskets? Do you know? I've been wondering about that the whole time we've been sitting there. In other words, other people groups, cultural or artistic influences on them. Is there very much of that that the two of you have seen, or?
Again, going back archaeologically or so on, there are distinctive Coushatta elements. We've identified 400, 500 years ago. Borrowing is an interesting term because, like we talked about earlier, but I don't know. What do you think, Denise? I think there's Coushatta, but all people share ideas.
Right. That is a difficult one to answer. The example that comes to my mind with that question is back when the trading post was developed or was built or brought to the community in the 1960s. And there was this whole movement where they were inviting basket weavers from the Mississippi Choctaw to come to the community and teach some of their techniques and trying to revive certain things that may have gone to sleep, certain ideas or efforts. And the conversations that happened around those interactions of, that they had learned, but yet there was a very distinct Coushatta way of doing this. And so that came out very prominent in those interactions. But in terms of sharing, I mean, of course, that's gonna, ideas are going to be shared, and that's what happens with innovation. When you're innovating, you're borrowing, you're being inspired by different ideas. And certainly, I know that the Tunica Biloxi, there are a few weavers in that community who've pointed to Coushatta basket weavers as inspiring them in their efforts. And so certainly it's not really an easy thing to answer, but that's probably the closest we're going to get is, yes, there's going to be some borrowing of ideas and some inspiration.
Cross-pollination, maybe.
Great term.
I'm wondering, yeah, it almost sounds like guitarists and fiddlers, and they sit around and they, fiddler A hears what fiddler B, C, or D is doing elsewhere, and they say, I like the way that, she does a certain technical whatever, and then somebody else says, well, I like thus and such and so, and they begin to then, take these ideas and sort of toss them back and forth and make them their own. So it still has elements of the original, but then they've personalized it, and that's what I was thinking in terms of the borrowing, just more like musicians do. Especially too if they're sitting there, and today with the all the forms of electronic mass communications like what we're using, like Zoom, like Facebook Live, like any kind of streaming service where they can see this stuff instead of hearing about it or even having to meet somebody, they can just watch it unfold, on a screen, and then borrow a technique, and they like this other person's technique and they appropriate it for themselves.
I think, absolutely. And, but I do think there is still the cultural continuity. There's innovation and there's tradition, and they balance each other. And what we've observed is in the Coushatta community, something, has to be viewed as looking right and feeling right and so on. And, I have a funny story to tell. It's not about baskets, but it's about fry bread. And I remember my mother-in-law really, I'd say, I've got to be able to learn this. It cannot be rocket science. So one day she made the dough and she said, I'll fry some and you fry some. You watch me and then you fry it and we'll put it on the table at dinner. And I said, okay, this has got to work. So she fried and I fried and I'd put mine in between hers. And sure enough, at the end of the meal, all of hers was gone and mine were just sitting there, little lonely things on the, And afterwards, I asked my husband what he said. They just didn't look right. How could you tell? So often I'll be like, this doesn't make sense, but that's innovation and cultural tradition. Something just they choose not to quite adopt that one. And often we think it's just sort of going to be a given, but sometimes they're like, we don't really like beads in our baskets. I've seen other tribes do that, but it doesn't really feel like one of ours. So we'll just let that go.
They probably have an intuitive grasp of what's theirs. I mean, it goes beyond the observational, like, well, I see this and it's one of ours or it's not one of ours, but it's more, I hate to say this because it sounds corny, but like a feel for it, but again, it's all intuitive. I mean, because they have lived with this for so many years, it's become part of them.
People often ask me if I can tell the difference between a Chitimacha basket or a Coushatta basket. And typically I can, but I promise you they can. And they respect each other and they love to go, as Denise said, to intertribal workshops, watch each other, get together. But borrowing sometimes, not always.
Yeah, there has to be some creative rivalry somewhere along the, you think of, again, like I go back to the musician analogy again, where they're looking at each other and the way that they, pick the guitar or the various the various techniques that they use. I mean, I know blues musicians do that because I'm a big fan of the blues, and they all sit there for hours on end watching each other play and figure out what this person's doing. And then again, can I do it better? Can I one up so-and-so? So I have to wonder if these artisans aren't doing some of the same thing. Can I one up them and do it, but do it better?
I think that's all people, all artisans, all music, to some extent.
Yeah.
A sense of pride in what you do.
Yeah. That elephant basket was quite spectacular with all the little baskets, you know, as making up the big basket of the elephant. I mean, that's incredible.
Did I show this one also?
No, we haven't seen that one.
This one, the artistry of it, and you can see this is a typical pattern on the regalia, the diamond or the half diamond, and then here at the bottom, so it's like her dress, just incredible, you know, the detail even in her face. And so this is the inside of the lid and the bottom, and very, very, very tight. I'm squeezing it now and you can't see. You can't.
Right. And that one's pine straw?
Yes, this is pine needle. This is actually made by the woman who made the elephant.
Oh, wow.
But
And is the zigzag thread, or is that more pine needle?
it's the red is raffia. This is actually dyed raffia, but this has, sometimes they have embroidery thread. This one doesn't. Not sure if I've got one here with embroidery thread. Sometimes the decorations have that, but no, it's all done with pine needles and raffia.
You can tell she didn't learn last week to give a North Louisiana hillbilly assessment, but really, I mean, she didn't learn that last week. I mean, that's years and years of practice.
Yes, very much so. And there's no pattern. So you just sit down and, like people, carvers and other people talk about that, you know, it wanted to be an elephant. It came out as, you know, or whatever, a basket, a butterfly. I wanted it 6 inches, but it came out 8. And you hear that a lot in their language, just as they talk about it.
So you said their language is a trade language. Can you tell us a little more about it and you know, what regions of the country it was used in since they moved here?
No, their Coushatta is not a trade language. That is the tribal language. I was referring to Mobilian, which is a trade language that was used among many of the indigenous communities in Louisiana and beyond, right? Which is it's a, you know, as trade languages are, it's a amalgamation of several languages. So some would say with very strong Choctaw roots, but you know, that's up for debate.
I tell people either
that was
the Mississippian era, you know, roughly the Muskogean tribes. Some people would say that goes up as far as what you were talking about, the Ohio River Valley, but certainly, you know, the Tennessee River Valley, all the way through the South and Southeast, Alabama, Georgia, and possibly as far as Arkansas, up into, you know, it's extensive through Louisiana into Texas. So a lot of tribes, a lot of elements. That's been pretty well researched, both linguistically, archaeologically, historically. And that does suggest, of course, if the trade line, like Denise said, if the trade language exists, things were being traded that far. We don't necessarily see the baskets, but we sure see a lot of other evidence of the trade and the trade language that accompanied it.
Well, baskets are so perishable.
Yes. Again, depending on how they're used and how they're stored, certainly.
So are there YouTube videos of people weaving Coushatta baskets that we could link to?
Great question. We haven't done that yet. We do have, I'll have to find that link and send it to you. The one that we just did that with the younger weaver demonstrating is on the festival's YouTube channel, I believe. I know I have the link for that, but, and then we've produced some videos of weaving and so on, but not a how-to in any sense.
Well, even a demonstration would be cool because, you know, you see the finished product, and I have no idea how you would go about getting from pine straw in the woods to an elephant. So that would be interesting to watch, just somebody working on that.
I'll try to find that also and send it to you. It talks about the cane and the pine needle basketry.
Cool. Yeah, there's a whole genre of videos, mostly see on YouTube, where they, you know, I'm going to take this hammer and make, you know, take the head off the hammer and make it into a sword. And then they videotape it, but then they play it really fast. So it takes like 3 or 4 minutes to watch the video that, you know, the guy was taking, you know, 5 days to do the work.
That's a great idea. And I'll share that with them. I think that is a wonderful idea. I know that part of our plans for the comprehensive educational packet for the, you know, the documentary and the video and some of the materials for classrooms and so on, that I think that would be a wonderful addition to that packet.
That could be another sort of an educational initiative, I would think, of the cultural minister, the person you mentioned that does this sort of work. I mean, and it probably would be another place too where they need a grant, you know, to go around the state and, you know, at the very least to shoot a video like Bruce is suggesting, and at the most go around the state and do workshops or seminars about this kind of, you know, creative work, I would think.
Yes, I agree.
Well, I used to love to go to Silver Dollar City more than Six Flags. A, because it's a little cooler up there, but B, they had the crafts. Like there would be a blacksmith shop, and they play somebody to learn how to, or I guess you already knew, but you know, just come in and do blacksmith. And there was a glass blowing place, and I don't remember it, but basket weaving would certainly be you know, part of that kind of stuff that, you know, people used to know how to do this stuff, and they don't. And it's kind of cool to watch somebody gets held on to those old crafts.
I love that place too. I used to bring my kids there. And yes, I agree completely.
Well, doesn't the popular version, for lack of a better word, the Louisiana Studies Conference has the Folklife Festival every year down there at Northwestern, and don't they host a lot of activities like this, like everything from woodworking to knife making to basket weaving? Don't they host this kind of thing? I want to say they do.
Yes, they do. And the Coushattas often participate. And of course, the last year was, you know, pandemic, but the Jazz Festival in New Orleans as well.
Well,
yeah, maybe next year.
Yeah, I mean, and it's definitely a way to get their message out and share their creativity with other people, just like we're doing with this podcast. If you know, people that, you know, oftentimes, particularly in the creative arts, they feel, or the creative endeavors, they feel as though they're alone in what they're doing. And it can be a very lonely place. And then they find out that there are other people just like them interested in the same kind of work. But then in the broader sense, they find an audience for their work. And again, some videos like this showing how specifically how they do this, I would think would be immensely helpful for them.
What's that? Yeah.
It's way too hot. Pants are pants. The ones in the back, they were not helping.
Oh, okay, you took them off.
Yeah, what you think?
I didn't know. Hey, can you bring them out? I need to bring them.
Speaking of instruction, I've got to get off of this call pretty soon because I have to teach.
So are there any thing that we've left off that you would like to talk about? Stuff that Stephen and I didn't know to ask?
I think you guys have done a great job. You're asked all the best questions and, open the door for us to talk about our favorite things. I can't think of anything you left out.
Well, we definitely want you to repeat the name of your book and where folks can buy it, because I think this will be a popular book for both for people, but I think it would make a great gift to somebody that's interested in this kind of stuff.
LSU Press and on Amazon, and you can search for Louisiana Coushatta Basket Makers, Denise Bates and Linda Langley. And we're so honored and appreciative of the time you've given us to talk about this. It's been a labor of love for us, and we've enjoyed the time telling folks about it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for doing the research. I mean, I know this was hard work. Any kind of project like this is going to require an awful lot of hard work, but a lot of commitment on the part of the author. So we really appreciate your work in doing this and just getting out. And again, as you mentioned, it is a labor of love to commit oneself to a project like this. So we really, really appreciate it.
Yes, indeed. And thank you for coming on our podcast. Like I say, I kind of felt like I had a personal connection to this because I know in my own family, I'm old enough to know the older generation that had some of these crafts. And I never learned them. Like, you can buy a blanket at the store. Why would you want to learn how to make a quilt? I probably didn't start making, like cooking until I was in my 40s, that was driven primarily by hunger. So yeah, Stephen and I we go through the LSU Press, the other presses and university presses, scouting out our interviews. So I was really excited when I saw your book hit the shelves, and I hope it does really well, and that after everybody gets vaccinated, you'll be able to, have in-person, talks and be able to bring your baskets and people can look at them.
Thank you.
That would be fantastic.
Well, thank y'all so much.
Yeah, we really appreciate it.
Yes, we do.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
It really was. Well, y'all take care.
All right. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye.